Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 96, January 16th to 22nd, 1863. Last week, we had a good amount of stuff to cover, which included a lot of backtracking. We talked about the raid on Van Buren, which really wrapped up the Prairie Grove campaign, ending major action in northwest Arkansas. John Bankhead Magruder becomes a legend in Texas for his capture of Galveston from the Federals, which included an unusual event for the Civil War, a combined land and naval assault. We had action in Missouri, with John Marmaduke attacking Springfield and meeting a relief force at Hartville. Finally, we had the Battle of Arkansas Post, which could be seen as a power grab by John McClernand. This week, we want to talk about soldiers' pay, but first we need to wrap up the Fredericksburg campaign with a little event called the Mud March. Before we talk about the Mud March in Fredericksburg, just wanted to mention, and this kind of ties in, I think, to this episode in particular, and previous episodes we mentioned about it, that there is an extra Patreon episode this month. We did in December and now January, we did the two-part Gods and Generals movie review, which was in real time as I watched the movie again. And we will also have a picture slideshow from the Battle of Fredericksburg in not the Sunken Road, which is probably the more visited area of the battlefield, but the Slaughter Pen Farm, Prospect Hill area of the battlefield. So if you want to see what that looks like and those pictures and some commentary, that's also on the Patreon feed. So your support for the upkeep of the show is always appreciated, and I thank you all for your continued support. So speaking of Fredericksburg, though, we really have not talked about the immediate fallout from the battle. It may surprise you to know that most early reports from that engagement were positive for the Federal side. They had taken the town, and there had been headway on the left flank on behalf of Franklin's Grand Division, and there was even a dispatch that claimed the rebellion was in its death throes. Soon, though, more accurate accounts would come into the capital. Herman Haupt, our friend we introduced, would give the president a complete rundown. Efforts immediately started to stifle just how one-sided the battle was, and especially the amount of casualties suffered by Northern troops. There would be no hiding of the streams of wounded that made their way to the capital, though, which sparked folks like Louisa May Alcott and Walt Whitman to care for those in pain. Tactically, it should be noted, though, that the battle was full of missed opportunity. Burnside was unable to break through, and Lee was unable to counterattack. Besides a huge loss of life, there was little to show at the end of the day other than contributing to the swirling politics in Washington. Before the battle, we had speculated that if there was not great political pressure leveled on Burnside, there was at least some. Remember that his predecessor, McClellan, was very much dabbling into the political scene. Burnside was more of a soldier, so he wanted to stay out of that, and that was appealing. So there wasn't really a tug from the political arena. But following his defeat, this is where politics would rear its ugly head once again. This was not the right time for a Union defeat. The Emancipation Proclamation had been announced, but Lincoln's army, it would seem, would be unable to enforce this. And this is why we have winter campaigning, even though that is not the best time to conduct operations. It needs to be coupled with Union victory, and this announcement need to come hand in hand, and that way there's going to be some legitimacy to this announcement. Rumors of foreign intervention started to stir, Although, as we know, Antietam had been the high watermark for any real action. That is hindsight, though, and obviously it may have looked very different as 1862 turned the page to 1863. It's really always something we should keep in mind when we're talking about these things, is that we know how the story ends, but the folks who were living these events at the time obviously did not. So there were certain concerns that they had where Antietam really wasn't all that long ago, right? That was in September and Fredericksburg was in December. So then there could have been some foreign intervention or some support in some kind of way. Maybe some peace talks could have resulted from the result of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And obviously that's going to be concerning to the Lincoln administration. Peace Democrats were gaining in support and popularity, pointing to this battle as a reason to end hostility. While there were some in the Army who blamed these individuals, there were some, too, who thought they made sense. Fighting and dying to protect the emancipation of slaves was not something many had signed up for. There were rumblings amongst the Republican Party that Seward was pulling the strings behind Lincoln. Remember, he had been the leader of the Republican Party and a favorite as candidate before Honest Abe shows up. Lincoln, too, was seeing his fair share of criticism. It should be said that the president is quoted at this point as saying he would oblige those seeking to get rid of him. Seward, though, is going to be the target. Salmon Chase, if not leading, at least being a heavy advocate for his removal. Chase, of course, had aspirations of the presidency eventually, so he would want to remove all those in his path. That's going to start with Seward. Republicans would meet with the president and advise for the removal of Seward, who would submit his resignation. Lincoln, though, would not accept, and neither would he accept a resignation from Chase, or Stanton for that matter. By not accepting either Seward or Chase's resignation, the president would be able to successfully play the middle ground. Some good political maneuvering by Abe. If you recall, Lincoln's cabinet is a pretty strong group of individuals, and the kind of individuals that Lincoln thinks he's going to need in order to successfully run the country. So he wants to keep all of them together. So he's going to do anything that he can to make that happen. In the meantime, though, Ambrose Burnside would write that he accepted responsibility for the defeat at Fredericksburg, penning a letter and backdating it to Halleck. There is a constant theme of inadequacy from the general. And I will say, as having been a hiring manager before, as I'm sure many of you have been in the past or present, it's never really good to hear someone say that they think themselves unfit for the job at hand. That's not going to bode well for confidence. It's also probably not going to be a good hire, so it's probably not what you want to hear out of your commanding general. This sentiment is not going to be a boon to the morale of the army as well. There were a lot of fingers pointed, some at Burnside. You have to feel for the guy, though. Fredericksburg weighed heavy upon him, the general likely depressed after the defeat. If you combine the defeat with the harsher winter conditions, poor supply, and the fact that many soldiers had not yet been paid, then you are looking at a tough job. Rank and file were eager to settle into winter quarters, establishing dwellings to protect against the elements. Men were falling ill, and funerals were commonplace. Many received reports from the home front and were frustrated at the struggles their families were enduring. Lack of pay would add into this frustration because they were not able to be there to help in person, and they were not able to send their wages home for even that kind of monetary support. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of unhappy soldiers. Something we have often overlooked when describing winter quarters is the general low morale. Temperaments of the soldiers were different in the face of boredom, cold, and sickness. If you combine that with a heavy defeat in what is not usual campaigning season, then you have potentially a disaster on your hands. But it was not just the common soldiers. General officers, too, were making life hard for Burnside, and there were some, like Hooker, who were borderline insubordinate. Burnside was going to have to try again, which would prove unfortunate for the Army of the Potomac. The plan was to move to a nearby ford, cross, and force a Confederate retreat from Fredericksburg. Moving Hooker's and Franklin's grand divisions, they would spearhead this assault, crossing the Rappahannock. January 20th would see the beginnings of the advance known as the Mud March, which would commence even with the opinions from Hooker and Franklin that this move was not going to work. Troops almost immediately started falling out of the ranks. Winter conditions had made the roads mud, and rainfall would make not only things miserable, but also weigh the men down with wet knapsacks and blanket rolls. Soldiers would find it difficult to sleep in the wind and rain, those that did waking up in puddles. A poem written by a soldier puts this on full display. Now I lay me down to sleep, in mud that's many fathoms deep. If I'm not here when you wake, just hunt me up with an oyster rake. A war correspondent would write, "The ground had gone from bad to worse, and now showed such a spectacle as might be presented by the elemental wrecks of another deluge. An indescribable chaos of pontoons, vehicles, and artillery encumbered all the roads, supply wagons upset by the roadside, guns stalled in the mud, ammunition trains mired by the way, and hundreds of horses and mules buried in the liquid muck. The army, in fact, was embargoed. It was no longer a question of how to go forward, it was a question of how to get back." It would be one thing if the army suffered through these terrible conditions and then was able to at least accomplish their objective. But things were not going to go Burnside's way, and the Confederates were prepared for the advance of the enemy across the Rappahannock at Banks's Ford. Burnside would realize the movement was not going to work and started to recall the men, but the damage was done. There were many desertions, and some men died, being already sickly, traveling in the winter conditions. There were accounts of men breaking their weapons on trees in frustration. When finally returning into camp, some of the reinforcements arriving from Sigel's reserves had either torn down or repurposed the winter quarters, adding a final insult to Hooker's and Franklin's men. Morale in the army would be at an all-time low. So we see here that the Mud March in particular is going to make Stones River that much more important because it's going to be something that Lincoln can at least point at. Grant really gets nowhere in his attempt at Vicksburg. The most recent attempt, Sherman is repulsed at Chickasaw Bayou with some disproportionate casualties. Then Fredericksburg, now a failed offensive that we read that the war correspondent's writing about it, so people are hearing about it at home. So we can say that it is very important that Stones River happens in the winter of 1862. Now, would it have been the end of the world, the end of the war, if Stones River had gone a little bit differently? That's probably a topic for another day, maybe, but I would say that's probably not going to be the case. But obviously, it's going to be something that the Lincoln administration desperately needs, and a loss in Tennessee would have been sort of the cherry on top to such a terrible winter. As they trudge through the mud, there is going to be low morale in the Army of the Potomac, not only because of the conditions that they are marching through, but also because they had not been paid. In fact, this was an issue for not only the Northerners, but also the Southerners. I'm a big fan of the Byzantine History podcast, and the main takeaway you can have if you are planning on being an emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire is that you need to be able to pay your majority mercenary army. For your armies from the American Civil War, you can imagine this is going to be an issue while you're on campaign. The winter is when the supply, including the pay, can catch up to the soldiers. If you are running around with wagons full of cash, that might also be a problem if you run into Stuart, Forrest, Grierson, or any other cavalry command. Both sides are going to face the issues of having to make some more money in order to pay their soldiers, which of course is not so good for inflation. It is also not good if you are a Southern soldier because the North printed and circulated Southern money to drive up that number as they gained in territory controlled in the South. The printing of money was necessary, though, in order to save on metals. Initially, it was not backed by anything other than the government's goodwill. This we may have mentioned previously in one of our brief talks about money. And yes, we have talked briefly about money a couple of times, but I want to actually break down soldiers' pay and how exactly that worked. How often did Civil War soldiers get paid is a good place to start. The answer is every 2 months, but as we have already discussed, this is not a real option on campaign. Confederate privates received $11 per month in pay, while the Union privates would receive $13. Later in the war, with the South desperate for manpower, the pay for privates rose to $18 a month. This would be to hopefully combat desertions, especially as the war was not turning out so good in places like Tennessee and Mississippi. Colored troops would see initially $10 a month, with $3 used for clothing expenses, but this would be done away with before the end of the conflict. For the Union, this $13 would equate to approximately $452 in today's money. This would mean that a Civil War private would receive $5,000 per year. Federal seamen would be looking at $12 as a recruit. Ordinary seamen were looking at $14. Obviously, they would make more at their skilled trade, but one would think the recruits would need a monetary incentive to switch to, say, the river fleets. Early in the war, there is still going to be a grog ration for the Navy, but it's going to be discontinued, which, depending on if you're a teetotaler or not, could be a good selling point. There are several more places where the pay between the two sides is very different. Sergeants are about the same at $17 a month. A lieutenant in the Federal Army would make over $100 a month compared to $90 in the Confederacy. A colonel in the Union Army would receive over $200 a month as compared to $195 for the South. A big area in terms of discrepancy comes in the pay for generals. Confederate generals each made $301 a month compared to $315, $457, and $740 from brigadier to lieutenant general in the Union Army. Now, there were allowances for officers in terms of extra food, clothing, and support for horses. Because of this, generals in the Confederate Army would actually be paid a little bit more. In several of our memoir accounts, there were good officers who used some of this income to supplement their troops in terms of food. Obviously, these were well remembered by grateful soldiers. Let's talk a little bit about conscription. We are a little ways away from the Conscription Act in the North, but it is already well underway in the South. In fact, it is going to aid in the numbers the rebels bring to the field in several battles we have discussed already. One thing we need to talk about is the ability to pay a substitute rather than be drafted. This could be done in both North and South, money going toward the war effort. In the North, this amount was $300, which was the wage for the common laborer for a year. Obviously, as you can imagine, this would benefit the upper class. In the South, you could also be exempt if you owned a certain number of slaves, which likewise is going to benefit the rich. Remember that we talked about that there is not going to be a whole lot of, what you would probably think about as your traditional plantation owner with quite a number of enslaved individuals, right? Most normal Southern families either didn't have slaves or they didn't have quite so many, so they're still going to have to be conscripted under these rules. It's these kinds of scenarios that would get the trope of a poor man's fight for a rich man's war, which does have at least some footing. Bounties, or in today's recruiting world we more gingerly refer to as sign-on bonuses, were offered as well, which in the later stages of the war in the North moved up to $300, which would help to try to avoid those numbers of men actually being drafted. We're going to talk about the draft riots that we had in New York, and obviously, if you've seen Gangs of New York, you've seen that kind of depicted in that movie. So we'll talk about why that happens, and obviously, as you can imagine, the less people that you're drafting, the less people that are going to be angry, and you're going to avoid these kinds of riots. On the flip side of that, if you're making your bounty the same amount of money that a laborer makes in a year, then you're definitely going to be targeting the lower class for sure. So, as you would imagine, the lower bounties were readily responded to by the poor. Men who would not have joined up otherwise get involved when the amounts get larger. These programs would go through several iterations, with pay coming in different forms and times. If you listen to the Frank Wilkerson Memoir Review, there was a colorful picture painted for bounty hunters and how they would disappear before they could see the elephant. There was even a description of a racket where a man was able to escape as part of a setup, it being theorized by Wilkerson that the man in question had done it several times before and was aided by the New York police. Still, those who were desperate and made it to the front had a mixed reception. Soldiers who wrote about the bounty men and conscripts often noted how haggard they already looked, even without campaigning. Marching was already hard work, especially on campaign. I have a quote here illustrating it. It took all night to march about 7 miles, the roads so clogged with teams and other things to hinder. Marching by rods is like dying by inches, and it gets an impatient man into a hell of misery. Scolding and swearing is dispensed at an awful rate when a regiment is compelled to halt and wait every few rods, if the road is good and the journey long. The road was continually blocked up by some obstructions ahead, so that we had to halt 3 minutes where we could travel. It was vexing beyond all control to stand there and hold our arching knapsacks, with a gigantic, never-ending hill looming in front of us, and the long, hard journey in prospect. We rarely halted long enough to sit down, but if we did, the calm would invariably start just as we were fairly seated. So that's going to conclude one there, and I love the imagery of a hill always in front of them, right? Kind of sounds like Lord of the Rings, especially the second book, the Two Towers, where Frodo and Sam are just marching up a mountain and then they see another mountain they have to march up, right? But here we have another quote. If a man wants to know what it is to have every bone in his body to ache with fatigue, every muscle sore and exhausted, and his whole body ready to sink into the ground, let him shoulder his knapsack, haversack, gun, and equipments, and make one of our forced marches, and I will warrant him to be satisfied that the duties of war are stern and severe, especially when every spark of energy seems about to be extinguished, and the last remnant of strength gone, and he is tired, hungry, sick and sore. So these are pretty interesting accounts, right? Showing us just the hardships of just marching. And we can think about it, right? That if you are from a certain type of background where maybe you didn't have to do a whole lot of manual labor, then this is going to be one of the things about military life that's going to disenfranchise you, right? We talked about, especially in the early part of the war, there's a lot of Southerners who join up and they think it's going to be sort of this great adventure. And that kind of ties into their chivalric way of thinking a little bit, right? That it's just going to be battles and whatnot and glory. And you do some of this for a couple days for a campaign, and then that sentiment is definitely going to shift. So we can also see that maybe if you were not in the best physical condition, that it could not be good, and the quality of such men might not be what either army was necessarily looking for. Soldiers who had volunteered would naturally look down on these men who were motivated by the government or by money to join the fight. This is where we get the jeering and name-calling and general disdain for the bounty men. When faced with a longer march, I saw one quote where a veteran soldier asked a new recruit how much of his bounty he had earned that day in the tough work. So that kind of gives you an idea of what they thought about them. And we'll talk about in a later episode that there's already this tribalism that kind of exists between units and armies, and these outsiders coming in, it's going to be hard to be accepted by the tribe that's already there. But for this episode, we can go ahead and call it a day right there. Today we had a little bit of a lighter fare. We talked about the infamous Mud March near Fredericksburg, which is going to prove the final act in Burnside's tenure as commander of the Federals in the East. We also talked about soldiers' pay and even went on a brief tangent about marching. Next week, we are going to have some smaller scale events, but most notably, we're going to have to say goodbye to Ambrose Burnside as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Spoiler alert, he's actually going to be back in the East toward the end of the war, so we'll tie that into our story in due time. You're not going to be able to escape those whiskers so easily. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon and Venmo information. And as always, support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.